Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the first book of Samuel, Shmuel Aleph, chapter 19. We stopped in the middle of chapter 19 with verse 10. We'll begin today's podcast with verse 11. We ended the first half of this chapter with we read of the attempt of Jonathan to bring his father and David back together to try to get things back to the way they were in the old days. But unfortunately, when David was successful in battle again, Saul's jealousy fired up again, and David had to run away. So we continue at that point, verse 11, Vayishlach Shaul malachim el beit David l'shamro. So Saul sent, so he now knows David ran away. Presumably he ran home. So Saul sends messengers to the house of David to literally to guard him, meaning not to guard him for David's protection, but to put a guard around his house in order to kill him, v'lahamito, and to kill him baboker in the morning when he leaves his home. Bataged David, and it was told to Michal ishto, and Michal, his wife, that's Saul's daughter, told David, her husband, Lamar, saying as follows: Im eincha mimaleit et nafshecha halayla, if you don't run and escape tonight during the night, machar atad mumas, tomorrow you're going to be killed by Saul's men that are waiting outside to trap you. So you better get out somehow in the middle of the night in order to save your life. Vatored Michal et David biad hachalon. Apparently David's house was maybe high on a second or a third floor, and there was a window, presumably that maybe in the back or someplace where the guards wouldn't see, or maybe it was really dark and they therefore couldn't see. She lowered him out of the window, vayelech, and he went, vayivrach, vayimaleit, and he ran and escaped in the darkness away to some safe place. Now Michal, knowing that David is going to need time to run, is trying to think of delaying tactics, that when the morning comes and the men are looking for David, she realizes they may search the house. So vatikach Michal et hatrafim. Michal took the terafim. Now terafim, this is in a very difficult a verse here, because it attacks our notion of David and his household and the special relationship that David had with God. We know that God forbids us to have images, godly images of idols, etc. And the terafim typically is understood to mean, and in its other context, the most famous other context where this term is used is in reference to Rachel when she took Lavan's terafim. And over there we understood that she took Lavan's terafim, which are idolatrous images and statues, typically understood to be fertility statues, that Rachel took them from her father's house. We say, oh, she took them from her father's house to separate him from worshiping Avodah Zarah. That is how the rabbis understand it, to separate him from his idol worship. But why was she keeping them? So this was difficult in the story of Rachel to understand. You'd have to look there in Genesis to see the different ways and try to see how you can understand that. But over here, one wonders, what is David's household doing with terafim, with idolatrous images? So there's various explanations that the rabbis take and other commentators understand. But it also seems like these terafim may have been something that Michal had. Who even knows if David had them? The fact that Michal had terafim, that she had these fertility images, we do know from archaeological evidence during the time that the people of Israel, and this time period, that many people had in their homes these little fertility goddesses. And it was common. Obviously, these were some of the things that they should not have had, but as we know, it took a long time for monotheism to take hold and for the people to get rid of their practice of idol worship. So the fact that Michal had them, she had them. It kind of grates our mind to think that David had these in his house. But this is what the verse says, that Michal took the terafim, And Michal herself, while we're about to read of a, and she's already acted extremely heroically in saving her husband, but her heroism is going to have some significant flaws, as we'll see in just a moment, and her faith in God was not nearly the same as David's was. And the verse deliberately shows this to us. So let's see what happens. So Michal took these trafim, these idols, vatosem el hamita. She placed them in the bed of David, one in such a way that it appeared like the shape or at least size and form of a man. Ve'et kvir ha'izim, and a bunch of goat wool or goat hair. Sama mirashosav. She put it on the head of this idol form to make it look like a human being with hair. Vatichas babaged, and she covered it with a cloak. So she basically took his blanket, made it look like there's a person lying in bed, made it look like there's hair on the head, so made it look like David is lying in bed. Vayishlach Shaul malachim lakachet et David. So Shaul then sent messengers to say, when David didn't leave his house, so Saul the king says, well, then go knock on the door and get him out, bring him up, because I want to execute him, I want to kill him. Vatomer cholehu. So she said, David is sick, he's ill, he can't come to the king, he's ill. Give him some rest, give him some peace. Presumably what Saul wanted to do was bring him to the king's palace, maybe put on some sort of mock trial, and then condemn him to execution. But she said, he's sick, leave him alone, let him rest. So Saul said to I don't care how sick he is, go and see David. Get him out of his bed and bring him over here, because he needs to be put to death. So Saul didn't care at all about the fact that he was ill. Vayavo hamalachim. So the messengers came, v'hinei hatrafim el hamita, and behold, when they looked inside, they did not see they inspected. At first, they might have thought they see a person, but then they looked and they see that what's in the bed is not a person, but it's just these idols, or this idol of kvir ha'izim rashosav, and on the top of his head, there's just so Michal apparently thought that the messengers would look in to verify that he's sick, and then they would report back to the king that he's sick. She didn't realize that her father was going to say, "I don't care how sick he is, get him." So they went to get him, and when they tried to get the person, so to speak, that was in the bed, they found that it wasn't a real person, and it was just a clump of goat hair on the head of this idol. So, Vayomer Shaul el Michal, and this is an important verse here. Saul says to Michal, Lama kacha rimitini. Why is it that you tried to trick me like this? So you helped David escape, and then you tried to trick me by making this idol, putting this idol in the bed. Like, well, what kind of nonsense is this? What are you doing? Vatishalachi et oivi vayimolet, and you sent away my enemy, and he escaped. This is a very, very stark and powerful statement. He just called David my enemy. He considers David his enemy. And therefore, he set up a situation for his daughter, which was an almost impossible situation, which was, you have to choose now between your father and your husband. You sent my enemy away, that we are enemies. Now, David obviously never considered himself an enemy, and Jonathan, when he understood who the enemy was, he defended he defended David, and he said, he's not an enemy. He didn't do anything bad, right? He actually helped you. Michal, who is David's husband, all the more so should have defended her husband at this point. But she didn't, and now she was very brave in terms of what she did and helping David escape and the ruse that she put on. But when confronted with her father directly, she didn't have the courage to speak up for her husband in front of her father. But rather, what did she do? Vatomer Michal el Shaul. So Michal said to Saul, Hu Amar Elai Shalachini. He told me, you need to help me get out of here. Lama amisech, otherwise I will have to kill you. So Michal, in order to protect herself, takes on the selfish characteristic, and which she, one could argue, may have learned from her father, that to her self-preservation, rather than stand up and do the right thing for her husband, she protected herself by placing blame on her husband. So now Saul, not only is he angry, but he's also just heard that David threatened to kill his own daughter, who is David's own wife. So if anything, this would stoke Saul's anger even more. Now, when one is, I do believe that it's not coincidental that we learn of Michal and her trafim and the idols that she had in her house, with seeing how she wasn't able to act with courage and bravery when her life was, or when she perceived that her life or her reputation or her status in her family's house was on the line. And again, I'm going to emphasize this point, and we're going to see in this chapter that this is really the point, the main point this chapter is trying to teach us. That when one looks towards idols and thinks that idols and statues and inanimate objects somehow hold some kind of power or represent some kind of godliness, and I say godliness with a small g on this world, so that we can serve them and worship them or do whatever rituals it is that we need to in order to get their favor, one is doing that selfishly. One thinks that the important thing here is me, and therefore I need to find out how to get what I need from this God with a small g, right? And one also is cowardly. One is cowardly, and one is putting his or her faith, so to speak, in something that has no power to help. But when one recognizes that there is one true God and the purpose on this world is to live the way He wants us to live, then one can tap into a humility and bravery. One can realize that, who am I? It's not important whether I am on top of things, it's not even important whether I am safe, whether I am sound, whether I have all the things I need. What is important is that I do God's bidding and I live God's life no matter what the consequences, that I live a spiritually and ethically and morally appropriate life, which is what God wants for me. Then I can do anything. I can accomplish or achieve anything, and I have the bravery and courage to stand up to anything. That is the difference. That's what Jonathan saw, but that's the opposite of what Michal saw. That's what David sees, and that's the opposite of what Saul sees. And this is the main issue, and we're going to see this as we continue reading this chapter. If we look back at what Jonathan said just in the last podcast, he says, David put his life in danger. This is verse 5. Vayatzem et nafsho b'chapo, and he struck down the Philistine. Vayas Adonai Teshua G'dola l'chol Yisrael, and God did a tremendous victory for Israel. So Jonathan understood that it was David's special relationship with God that gave him the strength to stand up to the Philistines and gives him the strength to be such a great leader in Israel. Michal did not understand that. Michal still had trafim, she still had idols, and therefore when she did not have the bravery and courage to stand up to Saul. She just figured out some kind of a lie to make herself look good, to make David look bad, and to stoke the situation, to stoke the hatred between Saul and David, rather than do the opposite, which is what Jonathan did, and at least Jonathan brought about, at least for a short period of time, a level of peace. So what happens with David Barach? David runs Vayimaleit, and he escapes. And where does he go? Because he doesn't know where to go. So clearly the best place for him to go is to Shmuel, to Samuel. Shmuel is by now a very old man, but he's still living a spiritual life, and he's teaching others how to live a life of godliness. And he needs to go to Shmuel, presumably for safety reasons, and also to find out what the next step should be. Remember, Shmuel had already anointed David the next king, and had already taken the kingship away from Saul. Shmuel now left it up to Saul and David to kind of work it out amongst themselves for what the transition is going to be. And David was sticking with the program, but Saul was not. So he ran Vayavo Shmuel el Shmuel Ramah, and he came to Samuel in Ramah, which is where we already know where Shmuel was from, and pretty much spent his whole life. Vayagedlo et kol asher asalo Shaul, and David explained the whole situation with Saul, what had happened. Vayelechu Shmuel vayeshvu b'nayot, and Shmuel and David then went to Nayot, which is a place near Ramah. Vayugad l'Shaol lemar, so it was told to Saul, people came back and said, Hinei David b'Nayot b'Ramah. We see that David is now in this place of Nayot in Ramah. Vayishlach Shaol malachim lekachet et David. So Saul sent messengers to go and get David and bring him from Nayot and bring him to the palace to put him to death. Now, what is happening in Nayot? Apparently Nayot is where Shmuel is teaching a group of prophets, teaching them about God and teaching them how to be prophets. We see that is why he went to Nayot. So Samuel's response, and I want you to think about this because this is really crucially important. David was in terrible crisis. He has no one to rely on except for, he has Jonathan, who's his friend, but Jonathan's hands are tied because he's Saul's son. Michal, his wife, who helped him, but also double-crossed him at the same time. So he's doing everything right, but everything is going wrong. The king is set to kill him. So he goes to Shmuel, and Shmuel takes him to a spiritual experience. He takes him to a group of prophets. We're going to read about this in a moment, what's happening in Nayot, and tells him this is when you have to connect to God. You have to remember that it boils down to God. There's a plan. There's something. What you need to live the right life. You need to do the right thing. You need to get your head screwed on, and you need to get right and bring your heart to the right place. And remember what the purpose of this all is about. It's not about David's safety. It's not about David being successful. It's about David living the kind of life that God wants him to live. So he brings him there, and now Shaul is going to be given another chance to recognize what's important, another chance to find a path out of his arrogance and his jealousy. But he's going to miss it again. But let's read how this happens. As I just read, this is verse 20. Saul sent messengers to take David out. Vayar, and he saw et lahakatan v'im nibim, and he saw what is happening in Nayot, and that is, he sees a group of prophets saying prophecy. They're in a state of meditation, a state of closeness with God. They're speaking the wisdom of God. Shmuel omed nitzav alehem, and Shmuel is standing on top of them, teaching them, showing them, guiding them, giving them a leadership. And remember, this is the place where Shmuel took David. Presumably David is there. Maybe he's not visible, or maybe he is. We don't know. But that's not even the point. The verse leaves David out because Vatihi malachei sha'ol ruach Elohim. When Saul's servants who come from the king's house and they're thinking they have to do the king's bidding, what do they see? They see this, and they themselves come enveloped in this spirit of peace. And they said prophecy themselves too. They become part of the group. They see this is holiness. This is special. This is what it's about. So of course, the whole concept of hatred, jealousy, the concept of anger and violence that they were going to take David, it just disappears. Suddenly, they are in a place where they're supposed to be. So Vayagidu l'Shaol, and it was told to Saul that nothing happened. Your messengers went and they disappeared. Vayishlach malachim acherim. So he said, "Oh, those guys are a bunch of losers. I'm going to send a new bunch of messengers." Vayisnabu gam hema, and they also got caught up in this wonderful spirit of prophecy. Vayosef shol vayishlach malachim shlishim vayisnabu gam hema, and then he sent the third set, and they also got caught up in it. So 3 times Saul sends these messengers, but instead of getting the message that maybe I should go to Shmuel and learn, well, he will go to Shmuel. I'm sorry, but instead of getting the message that maybe this is more important, the living a godly life is more important than my jealousy and my anger and even my kingdom and me being the great king and start being the founder of the dynasty, maybe I should ask Shmuel, okay, I have to hand over the Malucha, I have to hand over the kingship because I failed. Maybe I should hand it over to David, and I should be happy that I had achieved something great for Israel. I was the first king, and now it's time for me to pass over the baton, and because this is what God wants, and what God wants is what's important, not what I want. Instead of being humble and recognizing that, he still wants to get David. So now Saul says, I can't rely on my messengers. So Saul himself also went to Ramah. He came to the great bor, which is generally a water cistern that was in Sechu. Vayishal, and he asked, Vayomer Eifo Shmuel v'David, where is Samuel and David? Where is Shmuel and David? Vayomer b'Nayot Baramah. So here we have finally end that David was there too. He was in this group. And now Saul is thinking, okay, I'll definitely get him. But Yelech Sham El Nayot Baramah, and he went to Nayot, which is a place in Ramah. Vatihi alav gam hu ruach Elohim, and Saul himself also got caught up in it. He himself, at that moment, recognized, at least for the moment, recognized that I need to be with God. And the fact that David was there, and we get the impression that David was there in that same group where Saul was, Saul did not pay any attention. Vayelach haloch v'yisnabeh, and he himself was saying prophecy. He was also engulfed in the spirit of God ad bo'o b'Nayot Ramah, until he got to the place of Nayot and Ramah. Saul himself was given this special spirit. Here, this is coming almost like a gift from God, a moment of peace for Saul to finally, maybe here, God is almost saying, you don't necessarily deserve this, but I'm giving you this chance to recognize what's important. Vayifshat kamhu b'gadav, and he took off his clothing, and the clothing is the symbol of kingship. Remember, these are the royal clothes he's taking off. This is what differentiates him between him and the other people there. Being equal before God. When one strips off his clothing, one is the same as everyone else. This symbol, and he also prophesied in front of Shmuel. This is reminiscent of the early days when Saul was in his heyday, when Saul was the legitimate king, and when Saul had his relationship appropriately set with God. Vayipol orom, and he fell naked. Kol hayom mahu v'chol halayla, that entire day and that entire night. Whether he was really naked or whether he just wasn't wearing his royal clothes is not that important. But the verse wants to say naked because it wants to point out that the difference between Saul and the others that were there was gone. When you're before God, it's not about the person. It's not about the fancy clothes. It's not about his position. It's about living the kind of life that God wants you to live. And this should have been the moment where Saul recognizes that being jealous of David is pointless and wrong and leads to hatred and violence, and that he should cooperate. But so again, Saul is being given that chance, but he did not take that chance. That entire day and night he was naked, and he was simply in a relationship with God. Al Kain Yom Ruth, which is again why they used to say the saying Hagam Shaul Banavim, is Saul also one of the prophets. So Saul here again has the chance. This is the second time in chapter 19 where we see Saul has the chance to make peace with David, but he chooses not to. This concludes chapter 19. We are going to continue with chapter 20. Thank you so much for studying chapter 19 together. Looking forward to having you join me again for chapter 20 and the rest of this beautiful book of Samuel together.